All right, thank you, John, and thank you everyone for sticking around on a Friday night, at least for Europeans. I'll just jump right into it since we're running a bit late. So in this talk, I'll argue that gradualism about the mind, or the mental continuity thesis, is a potentially misleading thesis which can lead to exclusive assumptions about mind and how it's instantiated in nature. I will then introduce what I call the capacity approach to mind as a version of minimal accounts of mind agency and cognition, which I hope might provide some helpful conceptual distinctions for the study of mind and agency and cognition in plants. So it is more or less similar in content, but from an ordinary language philosophy approach to Quinton's talk. And before I begin, just a few caveats. Against gradualism does not mean that I endorse sort of anti-evolutionary approaches. It's just mean that I think that evolutionary hypotheses about mind should be restricted to reasonable portions of the phylogenetic tree. And when I say in the title plants as agents, I really mean that plants should be considered as agents if they are capable of performing conative actions. And conative actions are goal-directed behavior which are resulting from affective states. And an affective state is something like want, desire, need, or goal. So if I have the affective state of being hungry, going to the kitchen and making myself food is a conative action. All right. Gradualism about the mind in general is just that the thesis that mind is distributed in nature by a difference in degree and not in kind. And as with all good ideas in biology, Darwin has said something about it. In this case, in The Descent of Man, Darwin writes, "The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not of kind. We have seen that the senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, imitation, reason, of which man boasts, may be found in an incipient or even sometimes well-developed condition in the lower animals." And I want to make a qualification here between what I term unrestricted gradualism and restricted gradualism. So unrestricted gradualism I take to be sort of more of a metaphysical thesis or a assumption about mind and how it is instantiated in nature, which says something like, all instances of mind in nature differ only in quantity and not in quality. Restricted gradualism might be a reasonable evolutionary hypothesis, and we could describe it as something like differences in mind between sufficiently similar organisms, that is physiologically, morphologically, or behaviorally similar organisms, is a matter of degree and not kind. In the latter, restricted gradualism, I think it's a perfectly reasonable evolutionary hypothesis, just as gradualism about flight in the class of Aves or Insecta is a reasonable evolutionary hypothesis. There are three claims that usually accompany unrestricted gradualism, which lead to some unwanted assumptions or biases about mind. So first of all, there is a commitment to a shared physical basis of mental properties. So for example, if you take an evolutionary gradualist approach, you take the evolutionary basis of consciousness and complex mental properties to be nervous systems. Second, if human minds are representational and minds differ only in degree, then we need to formulate or postulate or locate representational or proto-representational systems in the creatures that we think possess minds. And finally, centralized nervous systems and cephalized body plans are seen as evolutionary responses to the capacity of self-locomotion and the need to orient self when moving through space. So these three claims result in three prevalent biases or assumption about what mind is. And these are biases that are not only in sort of evolutionary gradualist views of mind in nature, but also in contemporary mainstream analytic philosophy of mind and action. So the representationalist bias, as Quinton talked about, is that mental properties and mental states, so beliefs, desires, intentions, perceptions, etc., are representations, and that these representations are the basic building blocks of minds. Simple organisms are taught to possess proto-representational minds, and the difference in degree of mind is usually taken to be a difference in what content these representations carry. The encephalocentric bias, on the other hand, is that the view that you need a brain or a functional equivalent organ to have a mind. Usually, the rich inner lives of humans and of our dogs and pets are usually located in the head of that being. And mental representations are localized in the brain, either by a relation of realization, such as in the computational theories of minds, or functionalism, where the brain is the hardware and the mind is the software, the algorithms, or the representations, or they're just a relation of identity. So mental representations or mental processes are equal to brain processes, such as the case in mind-brain identity theory or reductive materialism. And finally, you have the locomotive bias, which we can trace at least to Aristotle, in that only organisms that move need sensory abilities. So famously, Aristotle argued that being sessile or immobile, plants only have a vegetative soul or principle of life, which only exhibit growth and reproduction. Only when you move do you need a sensitive soul. And this bias and assumption is still prevalent in analytic philosophy to this day. So on an otherwise excellent book on agency, Helen Stewart writes, "I'm inclined to think that there are no clear actual examples of creatures without the power of locomotion that we might nevertheless want to regard as agents. Because it seems to me that the evolution of the powers constitutive of agency has in fact only been found necessary for creatures that move their whole bodies through the world." Now, how does these biases bear on the possibility for mind in plants? So plants lack a brain, they're non-cephalized and have a distributed body plan, and mostly they're sessile throughout their whole life histories. So all the biases come into play when thinking about minds, making it either very difficult to treat them as possessing a mind or being agents, or simply excluding them from the get-go. So what are the alternatives? So minimal approaches to cognitions are certainly an alternative. And I think also we should abandon unrestricted gradualism about the mind. So instead of taking mind to differ only in quantity throughout the world, we should take mind to be different in kind for different organisms. So mind is different in organisms depending on their physical constitution and their sensory and behavioral abilities. And instead of thinking about the mind as a processor of mental representation, we can view the mind as the capacity to acquire and exercise cognitive and affective abilities. And this is what I call the capacity approach in the introduction. And it's championed by Oxford ordinary language philosophers, where you see here Hans Johann Glock, Anthony Kenny, Peter Hacker, and Gilbert Ryle. And to give a brief overview of that, the principle of that view, let me quote Anthony Kenny. So he writes, "To Descartes' question, what am I? My own answer is that I'm a human being, a living body of a certain kind. As well as a body, I have a mind. That is to say, I have various psychological capacities, including especially the intellect and the will. To say that I have an intellect is to say that I have the capacity to acquire and exercise intellectual abilities of various kinds, such as the mastery of language and the possession of objective information. To say that I have a will is to say that I have the capacity for the free pursuit of goals formulated by the intellect." And then in adapting this view to a minimal or general approach to mind, we could translate the intellectual abilities of Kenny into cognitive ability, and the capacity for the free pursuit of goals into affective abilities. So before saying a bit more about cognitive abilities and affective abilities, just want to talk a little bit about abilities. So an ability is a disposition existing as a potentiality, and it's only actualized through its exercise. So vodka has the ability to intoxicate, but it can only intoxicate when it's actually consumed by creatures with the appropriate physiology. I have the ability to speak Norwegian, but I only speak Norwegian when I utter actual sentences or think or type actual sentences in Norwegian. In order for an ability to be exercised, something or someone need to possess the ability. In the case of vodka, this would be the liquid inside the container where it's stored. In the case of speaking Norwegian, this would be a person with the appropriate faculties for language acquisition and comprehension and knowledge of Norwegian grammar and vocabulary. And an exercise on ability is also realized by a vehicle. And the vehicle is the physical feature that is needed for the possessor of the ability to exercise it. So in the case of vodka, this would be alcohol. Alcohol is the intoxicating agent of the drink, which confers its ability to intoxicate. In the case of speaking Norwegian, this would presumably be the brain, specifically the bronchus area and the Wernicke's area, the vocal cords and other features of my body that are included when I speak. So an ability can only exist as a datable empirical event in virtue of being exercised by its possessor. However, the ability does not cease to exist when it's not exercised. My vodka doesn't cease to be intoxicating when it's in my bar cabinet, or I don't cease to have the ability to speak Norwegian when I'm shutting up. So mind then is seen as a second order ability. That's why we call it they call it a capacity, which is the ability to acquire and exercise other abilities, namely cognitive and affective abilities. So let me say briefly what cognitive and affective abilities are. So typical cognitive abilities are perception, memory, learning, attention, awareness, and so on. A general characterization or a minimal characterization could be something like the ability to attain, process, and or utilize objective information. Now, the exercise of cognitive abilities produce cognitive states or mental phenomena. Perceiving a red door, being aware of glass, recollecting a childhood memory or trauma, for example. And cognitive states are fundamentally true or false. They are related to objective state of affairs. In other words, they are veridical. Affective abilities, on the other hand, are such as the capacity to possess passions, appetites, attitudes, moods, emotions, desires, feelings, and so on. And a general characterization of this could be something like the ability to attain and possess a goal, which it can act in accordance with. And the exercise, just as with cognitive abilities, the exercise of affective abilities produce affective states, such as desiring light, wanting nitrogen, being hungry, loving your family, and so on. And affective states, in contrast to cognitive states, are fundamentally good or bad. They're desirable and undesirable. They're related to subjective state of affairs. Another way of saying it is that they're related to a state of affairs within the agent or of the agent. So for example, hunger is a bad or undesirable affective state. The satiation of hunger produces a good affective state, being full and content. Mind then is the capacity to acquire and exercise cognitive and affective abilities to produce cognitive behavior. That is, behavior that is directed towards a goal which will satiate an affective state. So cognitive behavior can be seen as a mark of the mental. And then we can say that if an organism has the capacity to acquire and jointly exercise both cognitive and affective abilities, we can take that organism to possess a mind. The mind of such an animal, or such an organism, sorry, we're talking about plants here, might be very different from the kinds of minds in other creatures. For example, it might be very different from the human mind. So cognitive behavior could then be interpreted as evidence for the possession of mind. However, it's important to stress that cognitive behavior is not what mind is. It is only the evidence for the exercise of mind. Mind is a capacity existing as a potentiality, and mental phenomena occur as datable empirical events only when that potentiality is actualized. In other words, when that capacity is exercised. The upshot of this approach, the capacity approach, is that neither the exercise nor the vehicle nor the ability is specified or laden with any pre-theoretical assumptions. Of course, we need to have a conceptual discussion about what the abilities amounts to, but it's not specified in terms of the biases, the representationalist bias, the locomotive or encephalocentric bias. The vehicle ability, the vehicle of the ability does not have to be the brain at all. And the exercise of the ability or the behavior, the perceptual behavior or affective behavior, can be specified according to the physical constitutions and capacity of the relevant organisms. So in the case of plants, we might want developmental plasticity or physiological plasticity to be a staple of how plants exercise their abilities, while we might not want to use that kind of capacity in animals. So are there cognitive and affective abilities in plants? Now, I'll go quickly here in the interest of time, and Quinten and Thiago mentioned a lot of this. So research in plant signaling and communication has uncovered that there are remarkable abilities in plants, or plants have remarkable abilities that might justifiably, or at least it seems so, be interpreted as cognitive. They are able to perceive a vast array of different physical signals. They have the capacity to learn by habituation or association, and memory and recollection. So that seems to be a place where it's not overly problematic. But what about affective abilities in plants? Now, affective abilities was the ability to possess goals and needs. And obviously, all organisms have needs and goals. They need to survive and reproduce. So in plants, you have the need for light, micronutrients, and so on. And you have the goal of avoiding desiccation, dispelling herbivores, and so on. So plants then can be hypothesized to possess minds if they exhibit conative behavior resulting from the joint exercise of both affective and cognitive abilities. And I'll leave this as an open question, but I think perhaps etiolation and de-etiolation could be seen as an example where the plant has a need of light, and it perceives different gradients of light and then grows in that direction, and as such has conative behavior resulting from the joint exercise of cognitive and affective abilities. And I'll end there. Thank you.